Okay, so let us start. Good evening, one and all from India, and good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you have joined. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you all to Adityan Ganesh, who is going to give a presentation today on an extremely useful and interesting topic called as algorithmic game theory. So algorithmic game theory, I don't know which subject can we compartmentalize it into. It's a very interesting and interdisciplinary subject which comes at the intersection of computer science, economics, math, and I'm sure you would love this discussion. And it's a great honor to introduce Adityan, who is one of the students uh, in batch D, and he has always been very supportive and always helped students and always helped raising a mathematician foundation whenever it came down to having a teaching assistant or explaining concepts to help students better understand many other subjects. So this is what we expect from our students. That is, whatever knowledge they have gained, give it back to the society and pass the baton to the next set of students. So Adityan, kudos to you for that. And I would like to thank a few more people who have joined us for this session. Professor Prajakta Nimburkar, as you all are aware, who took popular matchings problem for us. So thank you so much for joining in. MG Subramanian sir has joined us as well for this session. And I could see them. I'm sorry if I missed someone from the guest, or if someone is going to join later on. There are a few other people who may join later on. So thank you so much to all of you for taking out time. And without much ado, and not taking out a lot of time from Adityan's lecture, over to you, Adityan.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much, ma'am, Prajakta ma'am, for joining us in the lecture today. And thank you very much, Subramaniam sir, for joining us for the lecture today. So, I guess I'll start sharing my screen.
Adityan, can you be louder, please?
Yes, sir. So, is it better now?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So, we'll study auctions today. So, auctions are always those flashy things, which you watch, the IPL auctions. People sit in 8 tables, and we would want to study how auctions are to be conducted and how strategic behavior can be included and how it influences an auction. So first we'll think of what an auction is. Okay, so a seller has a single good, for instance. So we won't look at very complex auctions today, but we'll try to start building theory which can be extended to very complex auctions later on. But this acts as a good starting point. So suppose that a seller has a single good, say a slightly antiquated smartphone. That is, he's trying to sell a second-hand phone, and there are n number of bidders who are interested in buying the good, and those bidders are strategic in nature. So what do I mean by they are strategic? They are self-interested. They want to maximize their profits. They act in their own interest. And how do we model them acting in their own interest? We'll look at it a bit later. Okay, so we want to study the behavior of bidders across various auction formats, and try to come up with an auction format which ensures we can understand how the bidders behave as an auctioneer, so that we can also have a good estimate of how our auction will behave. So what do bidders want? So the key assumption in our model is the existence of a private valuation of each bidder I. So suppose I am participating in the auction as a bidder, and I am trying to buy a second-hand iPhone which is up for sale in the auction. A second-hand iPhone doesn't have a bill along with it. So if you are trying to buy a first-hand iPhone, yeah, it will have a bill along with it. But a second-hand iPhone does not have a bill along with it. So how do I exactly value the iPhone? So there is no absolute number with which I can value the iPhone. And the manner in which I value the iPhone is my private valuation. So if I think, okay, this iPhone is worth $100, yeah, it is $100. My private valuation is $100. and I say that my valuation is private because I need not share my valuation with anyone. So as an auctioneer, you cannot design your auction assuming you know my private valuation if you're trying to design an auction. So that means you have to design your auction assuming different things or conditioning on different things, but you can't think of you can't really condition on my private valuations while building up your auctions. Okay, so now given my valuation Vi, what would I want to do as a bidder? I would want to procure the good as cheaply as possible as long as the price is less than my valuation Vi. So what does this mean? So suppose I think that the second hand iPhone is worth $100. Ideally, I would want to walk home with the iPhone with by paying $0. Well, that's not possible. I would want to pay $1. That's not possible. $2. I want to buy the iPhone as cheaply as possible. But if the price of the iPhone crosses 100, so if the price of the iPhone is 101, now I don't want to buy the iPhone anymore because it is more than what I think the value of the iPhone is. Okay, so that is what I mean, that bidders would want to acquire the item as cheaply as possible as long as its price is less than his private valuation Vi. Okay, so now we will define something called the utility for the function of my private valuation. So suppose I don't win anything at the auction, my utility is 0 because I don't pay anything, I don't get anything. Now suppose I win something in an auction. So in this case, if I win the Apple the second-hand iPhone at a price P, then you can think of my utility in some sense as the profit I make out of this transaction. So suppose my valuation is Vi and the price I pay for it is P. The profit I make in some sense is my valuation minus the price, Vi minus P. So that is what I mean by the utility. So if I had been clever enough to get the iPhone for $70 when I value it to $100, my utility will be positive with $30. But whereas if I by some brain trade or something, I just buy the iPhone for $102, then my utility will be 100 minus 102, that is minus $2. So I will go home with a negative profit or a negative utility. So what I would suggest is, while you're going through this lecture, maybe you can just write down these definitions here, because later on you might need to remember a few things, and it might be easier if you have actually written down your definitions. Okay, and what would the bidder want to do? He would want to maximize his utility. So yeah, it makes sense, right? If my utility in some sense reflects my profits, then I would want to maximize my profits, right? So we would, as a bidder, I would want to increase my profit or utility as much as possible. Okay. So very tempting thing to do while you're studying auctions is to actually begin with a very flashy looking auction where there's a big budget of 80 crores and you want to buy a big team of players and study what you would want to opt for Ben Stokes, how much you want to pay for Ben Stokes and Ronak Cut, but that's complex, as I had told you. So we would begin with very simple auction formats called the sealed bid auctions. So unlike the auctions all of us are really familiar about, where we sit at one corner of the room and we raise a placard saying, okay, I want to increase the bid. The sealed bid auction is more like a one iteration auction. So what I'll do, the auction has 3 steps. In the first step, each bidder will write down his bid in a sealed cover and give it to the auctioneer. And note that the bid need not be equal to his valuation. Okay, if my valuation is $100, it's absolutely fine if I write the number 70 and give it to the auctioneer and saying, okay, I'm going to submit 70 to you, the number 70 to you. Okay, and once every bidder submits his sealed envelope, the auctioneer opens the envelopes and decides who gets the good. This is the second part of step of the auction. So the auctioneer has 2 choices. He can decide who gets the good, or can decide nobody gets the good. But how he decides, or who gets the good, given a set of bids, whom he gives the good to is already pre-decided, or the manner in which he decides the winner is known to everyone. That is not something which is hidden. So even if he decides not to give the good, like that is already known. Like you would, as bidders, you would know if each of so and so people bid so and so amount, you would know that the good is going to go unsold at the start of the auction. It's not like after bidding the auctioneer can act as he thinks. And now we look at this step 3. The auctioneer decides on a selling price of the good. So note the difference between 2 and 3 is very important. In step 2, the auctioneer says, okay, if A, B, and C participate in the auctioneer says, okay, B wins the auction, he gets the good. But in step 3, the auctioneer decides, okay, B has won the auction and he is going to pay, say, something like $50. Okay, so again, I'll reiterate on this fact. Note that bidders can bid values other than their actual valuations. If the valuation of a bidder is $100, and if the bidder thinks he can maximize his utility by bidding a $90, by submitting a $90 to the auctioneer, the bidder would go ahead and do so and need not stick to his $100, which is his private valuation. So this is why the valuation being private comes into the picture. If his valuations are known to everyone, the auctioneer can ignore his bid and act as if he already knows the private valuations, or he already knows the valuations. But the entire process becomes interesting because the auctioneer does not know what the valuations of the bidders are, and he has to act on a signal which each bidder gives to the auctioneer, that is their bids. Okay, so we'll look at a very nice implementation of step 2. What is step 2 here? The auctioneer decides who gets the good. So a very natural implementation is the auctioneer gives the good to the person with the highest bid. So suppose someone bids $90 for the second-hand iPhone, and $90 is the highest bid. Then this person would get the bid, get the iPhone. So now we'll look at step number 3. Now, as a toy example, suppose the auctioneer decides to be a very nice person, and he decides to give the iPhone for free to the winning bidder. Okay. Then we will think what happens if I am a bidder. Like, there is no necessity that I will have to write a very small number as a bid and then give it to the auctioneer. I can just choose a very arbitrarily big number, write it on my bid, and then give it to the auctioneer, because irrespective of what my bid is, if I win the auction, I need to pay 0, or even if I lose the auction, I need to pay 0. So now it just becomes a number game. Like, whoever writes the biggest bid on his envelope, like, he will get the second-hand iPhone. Okay, so even though this auction is a very poorly designed auction, because now, like, we have no idea who will do what. We just know that everyone would want to write as big a number as possible. But this demonstrates a scenario where bidders are benefited by submitting a bid other than their valuations. So for instance, if my bid is actually $100, who knows, I can just write 10 crores or even put a factorial at the end of it and then submit it as a bid, right? Like, it's not going to affect me because I just submitted a false bid. In fact, it might even benefit me if I had written the highest bid amongst all bidders. So implementation 2 is the next most, or the most natural implementation which all of us can think of. So as before, the auctioneer will award the good to the highest bidder. So if $90 is the highest bid, the auctioneer will award the good to the highest bidder. But this time, the auctioneer will ensure that he will ask the winner to pay what his bid was. So in our example, he'll ask the winner to pay this $90. But if we think of this, it's very hard as a bidder to try and understand what is the actual number you should bid for. I'll give you an example why that is the case. And as an auctioneer, it's also very hard to predict what your outcome of the auction will be. So if you're an auctioneer and you will also be trying to get at least some profit, or you'll be trying to get some satisfaction or some value out of it if you're the government. Like, you don't want a profit if you're a government, but you might want some value property. I'll talk about those a bit later. But it is very hard to predict any property which you'd want to meet if you are trying to run this kind of an auction. And in many scenarios, once the auction is over, if I'm a bidder, I might look back and think, okay, I might not have written a particular number on my envelope. I could have written another number. So if I had bid $75, in hindsight, I might think, oh no, I could have bid an $80 and I could have still done better than writing 75. Okay, we'll see why that happens now. So suppose you are participating in a first price auction to buy a second-hand iPhone as usual, which you value to be $100. Now, what will you bid for? If you bid $100, then what will be your utility? If you lose the auction, your utility will be 0 anyways, because you're not getting anything and you're not paying anything. And if you win the auction, you are getting, your entire valuation, you are getting something worth around $100 for you. And you will also have to pay $100 to the auctioneer. So what is your utility? It's 100 minus 100, which is 0. So you will get a utility 0 anyways. So then what's the point of bidding exactly 100? What you do is you would want to shade down your bids. You would want to reduce your bid so that you say, okay, if I lose the auction, I'm going to get 0. Like, I'm going to be as I was if I had bid 100. But if I win the auction, my valuation is 100, and because I have bid 75, my 100 minus 75 is going to be 25. I'm going to take a $25 utility along with me, a $25 profit along with me. But as soon as the auctioneer tells me that I have won the auction, now the next question which is going to cross my mind is, oh wait, why did I stop at 75? I began at 100. I decided I'm not going to bid 100 because my utility is going to be 0. I reduce and then say I'm going to bid 75. But I could have just reduced further and say I could have just bid 70. Who knows? I could have won, and my utility there could be 100 minus 70, which is 30. Or who knows, maybe 65. So now in hindsight, you might want to, you would think that, okay, I could have, reduced my bid further and walked home with a higher utility. Or if you had bid 75 and if you had actually lost the auction, and you also get to know that the winning bid is actually $85. Then again, in hindsight, you'll be, sad because you said, oh no, $85 is less than my valuation. So if I had bid something like $86, I would have won the auction. But look at my utility, because I win the auction, I get something worth $100 and I have to pay $86. And the difference is $14. So what does this mean? I could have bid something higher than what I had actually submitted earlier at the start of the auction, and I could have made some more profit than what I made in the actual auction. So there is some regret when you think of what had already happened in this auction. And in the previous scenario, so suppose you are the bidder with the highest private valuation. So suppose God just comes down and then says, okay, I'm going to look at all your just mind read all your valuations, and I'm going to keep the private valuations till the end of the auction. At the end of the auction, we are going to get that the info which God has already collected, and then we are going to compare it with how the auction has actually ran, and we get to know that $100 is the highest private valuation as a bidder has had. But the bidder, wanting to make some profits, he said, I'm going to bid $75. But another bidder who has had a valuation 90, like he would not have reduced his bid as much as the $100 valuation guy, and he could have submitted just $85. So the $100 valuation guy lost because he submitted 75, and the $90 valuation guy won because he submitted 85. So in the previous scenario, even if you are the guy with the highest valuation, you won't win the auction. And when you think of the highest valuation, in some sense, you can think of the need you have for the good. So for instance, you are trying to win an auction for a company to come to your locality and say put a road for you guys. And when would you be willing to pay more for that, or when you will be valuing the road more when you need the road more? So in what you can think about as your valuation is like the need of each bidder for that good. So if you really want an iPhone, your valuation will also be high. If you don't really want the iPhone, your valuation could be lower. So it might be 60 or 65 when someone else has 100. Okay. Okay, so what we'll do is you can type your doubts in the chat, and then we'll be taking the questions from the chat. Is that fine, Imran? So now we'll look at another auction format, which sounds very strange, but all of us have actually all the auctions which we have been working till now are somewhat very closely related to the second place auctions. Yes, sir.
There is a question I think that a few people are having, so it will be nice if you can clarify. If a person bids a certain number on an envelope, does he have to pay that much? Is the question, and I think many of them will have, so that's why I want you to answer rather than me answering one student in private.
Yes, sir. So wait, I'll go back to this. Right? So we have 3 steps, and in this, the second step is auctioneer decides who gets the good, and step 3 is the auctioneer decides on a selling price. Okay. And the question which has come up is more about the selling price of the good. Okay. So in the implementation 1, we said the winner has to pay nothing, right? And if the winner has to pay nothing, it is independent of what he writes in the envelope. So he doesn't have to pay what he has written on the envelope. In implementation 2, the rule which we have said is, okay, the winner of the auction must pay what he has written on this on his envelope. The losers need not pay anything. Like you got to pay only if you are winning something in the auction. So the rule which we say here is, okay, the winner of the auction should win what he has written on his envelope. So that is going to be the case in the first price auctions. In implementation 2, it is something specific to implementation 2. And it is not something specific to implementation 1 or the next implementation which we are going to see. Okay, is it clear? So because we had implementation 1, it will also act as a nice example because the winner pays 0. I don't think anyone would want to write 0 in his bid. If someone tells you if you write the highest number, you are going to win the good. So should I move on or should I repeat anything, sir? Or is there any more questions which I should take?
There is one more question. What if all the bidders bid only $1? So Imran has asked, what will happen if all the bidders bid only $1?
Okay, so for now we are going to assume we'll break ties arbitrarily, but it shouldn't matter. So you can even say I'm going to give the good to the person whose name begins with a H. That's absolutely fine. So we can break ties arbitrarily. Any more questions, sir?
So one more question that has come up is, what? Wait, there are too many chats. Mike, would it be best if the bidder bids 99 when his assumption value is 100? So in any case, he would be happy.
No, so suppose you bid a $99 when your valuation is 100, and then now what you would say is, okay, if you win the auction, you say, okay, my utility from this auction is just $1. What if I had reduced my bid? What if I had bid 95, or what if I had bid 90? What if no one has bids anything up to 90? What if I would have won the auction even after bidding a 90? So that means I would have won the auction with a utility 10 instead of a utility 1. So if you win the auction, you would actually feel that you could have actually written down a smaller number on your envelope rather than 99, or rather than whatever you have bid for. So this makes sense, right? So if you win the auction, you would think, okay, why did I write such a big number and win the auction? I could have written a smaller number so that I would have to pay less and still could win the auction. And if I lose the auction, I would be like, oh wait, like why did I take it so lightly? I could have written down something much more closer to my valuation and walked with some positive utility, some positive profit rather than a zero profit which I'm getting now.
Another question is, can the auctioneer decide not to sell because his valuation of the object is higher than the highest bid?
Yes. So this concept is called something called reserve prices. So what he's going to say is he'll compute, however he would want to, give the good to, and what is the selling price of the good. And then if he says, okay, wait, I thought I would want at least $50 out of this auction, and it turns out like I would have to sell it for $40. No, I'm not interested in selling this. So then he can decide not to give the good to anyone. Okay. But we won't look at this scenario today. It's not very hard to extend the theory, but I guess we would look at some other parts of the theory of auctions, and we won't really extend to this. But it is absolutely fine if the auctioneer decides not to sell the good. Like, caution, everyone in the hall knows, what are the scenarios in which the auctioneer decides not to sell the good. Now, the auctioneer cannot, just think at the end of the auction and say, hey, I don't like this number, I won't sell. Is that fine? Yes, sir. Any more questions?
What is the difference between the three implementations?
So the difference between the three implementations. Okay, so if you look at rule 1, 2, and 3, I guess when we say sealed bid auctions, one is the same for all the three implementations because everyone submits their bid on a sealed envelope. If you're looking at your flashy IPL auctions, that is when one will be different. But we are just saying we are going to look at this sealed bid auctions. And step 2 is also the same in all three of them. We are going to award the iPhone to the person with the highest bid. But our step 3 is where we are going to differ. In implementation 1, the auctioneer decides to be nice and he is going to charge nothing from the winning bidder. In implementation 2, the auctioneer is going to go on the other extreme. So he's going to say, I'm going to just charge whatever you bid for. And in implementation 3, well, that's the surprise. The auctioneer is going to charge the winner the value of the second highest bid. So the difference is on what the auctioneer charges in all these three implementations. And in implementation 1, it was just a toy example. Like, you don't really want to study that because it's now a numbers game. Like, whoever can come up with the biggest number. Implementation 2, that is not a very ideal scenario to start studying, because you have no guarantees on what the auction is going to give as an auctioneer, and you don't have no guarantee, or you have no idea what number you have to write down on your envelope to increase your chances of getting a good utility. Any more questions, sir?
Yeah, some of the questions I will answer on the chat. You can continue.
Yes, sir. So now this auction, the implementation 3, is known as the second price auctions or the Vikraya auctions. As before, the auction gives the good to the bidder with the highest bid, and the auctioneer charges the winner the value of the second highest bid. So suppose the auctioneer opens all the envelopes and the highest bid is $80. So he is going to award the person with $80 with the iPhone. And what will he charge the winner of the iPhone? He will charge the second highest bid. So suppose the second highest bid among envelopes is $75, and he is going to charge the winner $75. Okay, so it might sound strange why someone would want to do that. Why charge someone else's bid to the winner instead of what he has written on the envelope. But if you think of it, we can draw a parallel to the auctions which all of us know. So suppose we have that nice English auction where everyone sits in the hall, and then we start bidding at a good. So just consider the scenario when everyone else has dropped out and only 2 people are interested on the good. So suppose the good has crossed the value, the current bid of the iPhone is $70, and only 2 people have their valuations above 70. Now we will see what happens between these 2 people. They'll keep on raising the bid until another person drops out. Just when you're about to cross this valuation, or just when you cross this valuation, that is when one of the 2 bidders will drop out. So we will say that this person who drops out, so we'll call him B. His valuation was 75. Okay. So then what is the cost which the winner of the auction is going to pay? He's going to pay something slightly above 75, right? And that 75 also turns out to be the private valuation of the second bidder, or whatever the second bidder try to stick to and bid for till the end. It is going to be slightly above whatever the second bidder had wanted, right? And we are trying to mimic that in this scenario. So we are going to say, okay, so whoever the winner is, we are going to charge him the value of the bid of the second highest bidder. So is this clear what the what the Vikraya auctions or the second price auction means? So suppose the winner has bid for $80, the second highest bid is $75. We are going to charge $75 from the winner. So we are going to look at some nice properties of second price auctions. So when we looked at first price auctions, bidders had no clue how things are going to work. The auctioneer had no clue of how things are going to work. But our second price auctions are going to be very deterministic in that sense. Like bidders, there is a very simple strategy for bidders to follow. The auctioneer can kind of predict what the outcome of the auction can be. So we'll first make a claim. Kabir, I guess it will be convenient if you type your question out in the chat, and then I'll take the question from the chat. Is it fine? So in the second price auction,
Adityan, there are many people who are asking. They don't understand why someone would implement the Vikraya auctions.
Okay. So the idea is Vikraya auctions are pretty similar to the auctions which all of us know. So the auctions which we know is, and as I told, it's the English auctions. And if you won the auction, what would you pay? You would pay just something more than what the second last bidder had been competing till for. So the second last bidder had been competing till 75. You are going to pay something just more than 75. You like at the end of the auction, no one has any clue till where you would have gone. You might have gone till 80 if there had been another competitor, but at the end of the auction, no one has any clue what has happened. Till where you would go. But what we know is, like, whatever be the case, your bid intuitively is greater than 75. So we are trying to mimic that in our Vikraya auctions. And there are some more reasons why we would want our Vikraya auctions, because there is a nice looking strategy which all bidders can follow, which will be really helpful for them, much more than the first price auction. Like, the strategy is much more nicer than the first price auction. And as the auctioneer, you can also have a good check on how good your auction will perform. So that is the reason why we are performing Vikraya auctions. Now the intuition, we are trying to mimic the auction which all of us know really well. Yes, sir. Is there any more question or
You can proceed. Yeah.
so in the Vickrey auctions, so our first claim is there is something called a dominant strategy. So what is a dominant strategy? So suppose suppose at the end of the auction, the auctioneer opens the bids and then he looks at the bids of every other bidder than bidder I. Okay, so and we will denote this as B sub minus I, B subscript minus I later on. So suppose he stares at all the bidders at all the bids of other bidders other than bidder I. So suppose I am bidding, he'll look at the bids of everybody else except me. Okay, and then I'll have a nice arrangement with him, and then I'll decide to cheat. I'll arrange as if he's going to give my bid back to me. I'm going to rewrite a new number and give it back to him. Okay, so even if this kind of a cheating scenario is arranged, as a bidder I would not want to change my bid. So as a bidder, I have a certain bid which I can write on my sheet or on my envelope, which I would want to stick to, irrespective of what the other bidders do. Suppose A, B, C, and C are competing in an auction. A would write a number, and even if he is given the choice to take back the bid and write a new number after knowing what the bids of the other two bidders are, he wouldn't want to do that. He would want to stick to his original bid. So that we'll call it as a dominant strategy. Why is it called a dominant strategy? So if you think of the number which he writes on the envelope to be a strategy which he follows to get a good utility out of the auction, the strategy which he follows is dominant, because he'll always end up better than by writing this particular number than any other number which he can possibly write. And what I claim is, when we look at a Vickrey auction, there is a dominant strategy. That is, in the Vickrey auctions, for every bidder, or if I participate in in a Vickrey auction, there is a certain number which I can write on my envelope, such that even if I know what the bids of the other bidders are, I wouldn't want to change my number. And the nice thing is, this bid which I want to write on the envelope, it's not a very hard thing to understand. It's just my private valuation. So when I stare at the envelope and when I'm trying to decide what number I should write on the envelope, I know my private valuation, because I am the guy who is evaluating the iPhone, and then I'm just deciding what to how to maximize the utility for me. And the best way I can do that is to write my own private valuation on the envelope. Okay, so do you understand what a dominant strategy is, and what the claim of the dominant strategy in the Vickrey's case is? In the Vickrey's case, bidding truthfully, that is bidding your actual valuation, is a dominant strategy. I'll repeat this point again. So irrespective of what other people bid, whatever be the numbers they bid, you are doing justice to yourself by writing your actual valuation on the envelope. Okay, so this writing of your actual valuation, you will be referring to it as truthful bidding. Okay, so now we'll prove the claim why bidding truthfully is a dominant strategy in the case of a Vickrey auction. So we'll fix a bidder I. So the bidder I can be me, for instance, and the valuation which I have, I'll call it VI. Okay, and we'll just denote the bids of all other bidders are B minus I. This is just notation which looks a bit bizarre, but all it says is B minus I is you look at all the bids of the other bidders. Okay, so we will show that I will be maximizing my utility, or bidder I is going to maximize his utility by bidding, by placing his bid BI equals his valuation. So is the claim clear? So we'll continue with the proof. So let capital B be the highest bid placed by some bidder other than bidder I. So if I am participating in the auction, capital B is the highest bid placed by other bidders in the auction, apart from me. So if at the end it turns out if I am the highest bidder, capital B would be the second highest bidder, or if I am not the highest bidder, capital B would be the highest bidder. And again, if there is a tie, we'll break it arbitrarily. That's absolutely fine. Or we'll break it in such a manner to analyze for a particular bidder I. We would assume that the tie is broken in his favor, that he will get the good. And we will see why it won't matter a bit soon. So if the definition of capital B is clear, maybe I'll move on. So now if as soon as all the bids are decided and as soon as I write my bid BI, there are only two possible utilities which I can get. One utility is 0 if I'm not winning anything. That is, if capital B is greater than my bid BI. Or if my bid is greater than capital B, bidder I would receive a utility of valuation minus the second highest bid. Okay, so if BI is actually the highest bidder, capital B would be the second highest bid. He would win the good and he would have to pay capital B. So what would this utility be? Like whatever value he gets from the auction, BI, minus whatever he's paying, minus B. So this is one possibility. And what is the other possibility? The highest bidder, other than removing me from the auction, this is someone else, or I am not the highest bidder of the auction. So my BI is less than capital B. So then I'm not winning the good anyway. So my utility is 0. So there are just two possible utilities. Okay. So now suppose my valuation is less than capital B. I clarify here, it's my valuation here, not my bid. Suppose my valuation is less than capital B. Then the highest utility I can receive is maximum of 0, comma VI minus B. How do I get 0? By actually bidding my valuation. How do I get VI minus capital B? By bidding something else much more than my valuation, such that I overtake capital B to be the highest bid in the auction. Okay. And what is maximum of 0, comma VI minus capital B? It is 0. Why is it 0? VI minus B is negative because we began with the assumption VI is less than B. So maximum of 0, comma VI minus B is 0. So I would actually prefer to go home without any good rather than bidding a very high value for it and then walking home with a negative utility. And how do I achieve my 0 utility? I could have as well bid my valuation than trying to cheat. Okay. So this means if I'm not the winner, or if my valuation is less than the maximum bids in bidders other than me, well, I could just bid my valuation and walk home with the best possible result I could have hoped for. But suppose if my bid is greater than capital B, okay, then the highest utility I can achieve is maximum of 0, comma VI minus capital B. Because again there are just two possible outcomes for this option. And this equals VI minus B, the maximum of those two, because VI minus B is positive from our assumption VI is greater than capital B. Okay. And how do I achieve this positive utility of VI minus capital B? I could have just bid my valuation, right? Because I know my valuation is greater than the bids of all other bidders in the auction. Hence, if I bid VI, I would be the highest bidder and I would be awarded the good anyways. And what will be the price which I pay? It is going to be irrespective of whatever I bid for. If I bid even VI plus 1, VI plus 2, VI plus 3, what is my utility? It is my valuation minus the price I pay. My valuation is VI irrespective of what I bid. And the price I pay is also capital B irrespective of what I bid. The price I pay is dependent on the other bidders. So that means I would be achieving my maximum possible utility by bidding my valuation. So in both these scenarios, I would be very happy. I won't have any regret while I walk home if I had bid my actual valuation. Okay. So what does this result say? Bidders need not work hard to bid strategically in auction, or you don't have to do heavy math or heavy computation to finally figure out, hey, okay, this is the bid which I need to write down in my envelope to maximize the utility from the auction, my utility from the auction. The number which I have to write from to maximize my utility is simply my private valuation, right? And the nice thing about this auction is when the auction was designed, in some sense we said, okay, so if you are going to come and lie in this auction, you will be penalized, or you won't do good by actually lying. You are incentivized to tell the truth in the auction. So in some sense we have designed a lie detection mechanism out of nowhere, right? So this idea of devising an auction with a nice lie detecting mechanism is known as mechanism design, right? So we'll move on. So claim 2, this is a bit easier to understand. No participation regret. So what does no participation regret mean? So suppose I attend the auction, I don't get anything in the auction, and I will have to pay something. Or if I win something in the auction and I have to pay something, and I would have to pay much more than my valuation, that is my utility out of the auction is negative. And our claim is, if every bidder bids truthfully, then every bidder is guaranteed a non-negative utility. That is, you will at least walk back home with a 0 utility as you were before the auction. You would not lose money in the auction if you are bidding truthfully. And the proof, it's not as hard as the previous one. So all losers get a utility of 0 because they are not getting anything and they are not paying anything. Okay. So the only person whom we'd be interested in studying is the winner, because he'll be getting something and he'll be paying something. So what will he be getting? he'll be getting something worth VI for him. And what will he be paying? He'll be paying capital B for him. Okay. Now we are going to make use of two things. I is the highest bidder and I has bid truthfully. Okay. So that means since I is the highest bidder, we know that his bid BI is greater than or equal to capital B. And because he has bid truthfully, we know VI equals his bid BI. So from there we get this equation. VI equals BI, which is greater than or equal to B. So that means VI minus B is greater than or equal to 0. But what is VI minus B? That is his utility, because VI is what he gets and B is capital B is what he pays. So his utility is greater than or equal to 0. Hence for losers, it is non-negative because it is 0. 0 is non-negative. And for winners, it's VI minus capital B, which is greater than or equal to 0, which by definition is also non-negative. So upshot, what we are saying is no bidder would come attend the auction and would think, oh no, I would have been better off by not even attending this auction because I had to pay something more than what I hoped for. Okay. So now we'll think of something like what an awesome auction looks like. Awesome auction is not a standard definition; it's just a lingo which I'm using here. So we'll first define something called dominant strategy incentive compatible. This is an actual term and it's used widely. So what is dominant strategy incentive compatible auctions? So any auction that satisfies claim 1. What is my claim 1? Truthful bidding is a dominant strategy. In an auction A, so this we are trying to generalize to any auction. So in an auction A, instead of a second price auction, every bidder has a dominant strategy. That is, there exists a bidding strategy that a bidder can follow so that their utility is maximized irrespective of what the other bidders do. So in the second price auction, whatever the other bidders did, I should bid my valuation, right? So the same thing here, irrespective of what the other bidders did, I should write down one specific number on my envelope. Further, that one specific number on the envelope should be my valuation. So that is what that is when we say that an auction is dominant. The auction has a property that bidding truthfully is a dominant strategy. And claim 2 must also hold. What is claim 2? There is no participation regret in a DSIC auction. What is participation regret? We proved this, right? In an auction, every bidder bidding truthfully is guaranteed a non-negative utility. So nobody feels, oh no, why did I attend this auction? I was made to pay something which was much above my valuation. So if bidding truthfully is a dominant strategy for every bidder, and there is no participation regret, we will call that auction as a DSIC auction, dominant strategy incentive compatible auction. Okay. So what properties do we kind of expect from auctions in general? So one thing which seems reasonable to expect is to make things easy, makes life easy for the auctioneer and the bidders, is to hope that the auction is DSIC. That is, the auction is dominant strategy incentive compatible. So bidders are incentivized to bid truthfully and do not regret participating in the auction. So the auction maximizes social surplus. So I would focus on what social surplus means in the next slide. So I'll just define what social surplus is. If the bidder reports his bids truthfully, then the auction maximizes the social surplus. Summation I runs from 1 to n. That is summing over all bidders. The amount of good he gets, xi, times the valuation of his private valuation of his goods. So that is the social surplus of this. So what the social surplus means, we'll look in the next slide. But I just put it here so that the definition is complete. And xi is the amount of good each bidder receives. So suppose I am the first bidder in the auction, xi will be the amount of good which I receive. So suppose a person B is the second bidder in the auction, x2 was the amount of good which he gets. So of course, because there is just one unit of good which is on auction, the sum over all xi's, that is the sum of the quantity each bidder receives, should be less than or equal to 1, because the auctioneer in the first place has just 1 unit of the good. He can't give more than 1 unit of the good. And then step 3, the property 3 which we have is where we relate computer science. We say that the running the auction should be efficient in some sense. We won't be focusing on what efficiency means here, but for people who have done some computer science before, it just means it's polytime. Meaning this step 3 is not really important, or we won't focus about it here. It is important, but we won't focus about it here. Okay. So, sir, can I take some questions? Are there some questions?
Not really. I'm answering them. So if there is any question that I think that many people are asking, I will provide it to you.
Yes, sir. So we'll see what the social surplus actually means. So I just say that you multiply Vi times Xi, the valuation times the amount of good each bidder receives, and then we add it over all bidders. Okay. So we'll look at a very simple example first. We'll look at what the Vickrey auction does. If I am the winning bidder, the amount of good which I get is 1. And if I am losing bidder, the amount of good which I get is 0. So now note that the sum of the quantity of goods over all bidders is 1, because only the winner gets something, that is 1, and all the other gets 0. So we satisfy the condition that the auctioneer can give at most 1 unit of good. But if you notice, the auctioneer need not award the entire good to one bidder. So if he's auctioning an iPhone, he doesn't have any choice. He can't break the iPhone into 2 and give it to 2 bidders. But suppose he's auctioning something like food. He's auctioning 1 unit of food. So what he can do, he can say, okay, I'm going to give 0.6 units of food to bidder 1 and 0.4 units of food to bidder 2. Or if he's say auctioning something like a big collection of gold or something of the sort. So he's going to say, I'm going to give 0.6 of the entire volume to bidder 1 and 0.4 of the entire volume to bidder 2. Or it might be even 0.1 to, 0.4 to bidder 1, 0.3 to bidder 2, 0.2 to bidder 3, and 0.1 to the bidder 4. By bidder 1, bidder 2, bidder 3, and bidder 4, I mean like the highest, like the bidder with the highest bid or bidder with the second highest bid, and so on. So what does my social surplus now mean? So suppose I am a bidder who receives something from this auction, and I value 1 unit of the good to be $10, and I receive 0.6 units of the good. So what will be my valuation for 0.6 units of the good? So if my valuation for 1 unit is $10, my valuation of 0.6 units is going to be 0.6 times $10. Or in other words, I can say 0.6 is the amount of good which I'm getting times my actual valuation for the entire good. So my value for Xi units of good is going to be Xi times Vi. And what are we doing? We are summing up this value which we give to each bidder over all bidders. So we are going to ask bidder 1, hey, what's the value I gave you? He's going to give his Vi times Xi. I'm going to ask bidder 2, what's the value I gave you? He's going to give me V2 times X2. And I'm going to ask like so until bidder 7, say, he's going to give me V7 times X7. So when I sum them up, as an auctioneer, I can think about it as the total value which I have added to the society at the end of this auction. Okay. And what we want to do, we would want to maximize the total value which we have added to the society at the end of this auction. So one I think should be clear, DSIC properties, dominant strategy incentive compatible properties. 2 should be clear from this slide. I'll explain why 2 is important next. And 3, it just means that running the auction should be efficient. It should not be very hard to run the auction. Okay. So why would we want to maximize the social surplus? So I'll design an auction which is dominant strategy incentive compatible, but it does very badly. So what I'll do, I'll collect bids from all bidders, and I'll give the good randomly to some bidder. I don't even read what's in the envelope. I just collect all bids, and then I give the good randomly to some bidder, and I don't charge anything. So now see what has happened by doing this. So because I'm not even looking into their bids, there's no incentive for people to write something different from their valuation, because even if you had written your valuation or you do not write your valuation, I'm not even considering what you have written down on your envelope. So it doesn't matter what you write on the envelope. So you could as well write what your private valuation is rather than tell lies. And because I just give it to some bidder randomly, there's no way you can cheat, because the only way you can influence this auction is via writing a different number than your valuation. And when I said the number which you write doesn't matter anyway, there's no way you would want to change the course of the auction by submitting a different bid. So do you see why this auction is DSIC? It is DSIC because you wouldn't want to lie, because lying won't make sense, because I don't even read what you have written. And it of course doesn't maximize social surplus, because I could have just awarded the good to someone with valuation 0 while someone had a valuation $1 lakh, right? Because I'm just doing it randomly. So my auction does not guarantee me that I would be maximizing my social surplus. or I would be adding any value at all into the society by the auction, but I have a DSIC auction. So we'll understand what DSICness mean, or that an auction is DSIC mean, and what maximizing social surplus mean. DSICness of an auction says, as a bidder, you wouldn't want to lie. And maximizing social surplus of the auction means, as an auctioneer, you would want to maximize the total value which you add into the society at the end of this auction. Okay, so that is what my first condition, DSICness, says. So DSICness is more like a constraint on the bidders, saying that okay, if you lie, you are going to be penalized. And my second step, my social surplus, maximizing my social surplus, is more like a constraint on the auctioneer side. He says, okay, I'm going to try and add the maximum value into society as possible. It makes sense when the government is sitting on one side of the auctioning stuff. The government would want to add value as much as possible into the society, right? Yeah. So we'll redefine what an auction is. Okay. So an auction, as before, an auctioneer collects bids from each bidders. Okay. So let B equals B1, B2, so on till Bn. Be the bids of bidder 1, bidder 2, so on till bidder n. Okay. So the step 1 can change on how our auction goes. Okay. So if you are running a seal bid auction, we will be collecting it as bids and as defined here. If you are running our fancy English auctions, we won't be collecting bids as such, but we'll be collecting yes or no's from each bidder, saying, okay, so would you want to bid for the good at this price, or do you don't want to bid for the good at this price? Okay. So in our context today, we are going to collect sealed bids from bidders B1, B2, so on till Bn, which are bids from bidders 1 to n. And now we'll redefine what our rule 2 of the auction looks like. Rule 2 is, what does rule 2 say? The rule 2 is how the auctioneer decides to allocate the goods to the bidders. Whom is he going to give the iPhone to, or to whom, or how is he going to distribute the food he has in hand. So what does an allocation rule mean? So we'll look at an allocation rule X of B. So what X of B means? So given a bid B1, B2, given B, which is the bid of all bidders B1, B2, so on to Bn, my X of B is my X of B is X1, X2, so on till Xn, where bidder I would receive Xi. So for example, if there are 4 bidders and they submit say $1, $2, $2, and $4 respectively, so then my B equals 1, 2, 2, 4. What would my X of B look like if I decide I'm going to give it to the highest bidder? My X of B is going to look like 0, 0, 0, 4. Because auctioneer 4, bidder 4 bid for 4, which is the highest. So is XB clear? So what I'm saying is my XB is X1, X2, so on till Xn, where bidder I would receive Xi units of the good. And what is step 3? The auctioneer decides how much to charge the winner of the auctions, or how much to charge from people who are getting any good from the auction. And how do we describe it formally? So we'll say the payment function P of B is the payment which we would receive from each bidder given the bids B1, B2, so on till Bn, such that my P of B is P1, P2, so on till Pn, where bidder I would have to pay Pi. So suppose in our previous example of 1, 2, 2, 4, the bids being 1, 2, 2, 4, if we decide to implement our Vickrey auctions, so my X, as we saw, it is 0, 0, 0, 1. And what would I charge from the winner? It is going to be 2. That is going to be the second highest bid. So I'm going to charge 0, 0, 0 from the first 3 bidders and 2 from the 4th bidder. Okay. So now we are going to get really creative, and then we are going to call an auction with an allocation rule X and a payment rule P by X, P. Okay. So by our model, so we will see what the utility of the bidder is. So the utility of the bidder is what he receives, or the total value which he receives, that is Xi of B, Vi. So by Xi of B, what I mean is the Xi component, or what the bidder I receives when the bids which has been submitted by all bidders is B. We look at the definition of B here. So we are looking at Xi of B times Vi, that is the value of the good he gets, because Vi is the value of his valuation for the entire good, that is like 1 unit of the entire good, and he's going to get something like say 0.6 units or 0.4 units. So like his valuation is, the value which he gets is going to be Xi of B times Vi minus what he is going to pay, that is Pi of B. So his utility given the bids of all all bidders ui of b equals xi of b times vi minus pi of b. Okay. So for now we'll focus on payment rules which charge non-negative payments from the bidders. Because what does it mean by charging negative payments from the bidders? It just means the auctioneer has to pay the bidders, and we don't want that to happen. So we'll say we are going to charge bidders values which are greater than or equal to 0. Okay. So here I guess the definition of utility is very important, and the notation here are something which you need to remember as we go on with our lecture. So now comes the interesting part. So we'll define something called an implementable allocation rule. So what is an implementable allocation rule? So here we have an allocation rule which says, so given a bid B, I'm going to decide how I'm going to allocate my goods to the n bidders sitting in front of me, x1, x2, so on till xn. Okay. So given so for any bid possible or given an allocation rule x, so that is the auctioneer decides he is going to stick to the allocation rule x. We'll say that x is implementable if there is a payment rule p such that the auction x comma p is DSIC. So remember what DSIC is. DSIC says no one would want to lie and no one would walk home with a regret. So I'll say x is an implementable allocation rule if there exists a payment rule p such that the auction x comma p is dominant strategy incentive compatible. So an example for an implementable allocation rule would be, give it to the highest, the bidder with the highest value, or like in our example. So what did we do when we are trying to auction an iPhone? We gave it to the bidder with the highest bid. So that is one possible allocation rule. So you can give the entire iPhone to the person with the highest bid. And why is that implementable? So we said, okay, look at the payment rule of charging the second highest bid from the winner. So we proved that is DSIC, right? So for x, there exists this payment rule p which charges the second highest bid from x from the winner, which makes the entire auction DSIC. So that's why giving the good to the highest bidder is an implementable allocation rule. But how did we actually say that giving it to the highest bidder is an implementable allocation rule? We had to come up with a payment rule such that the entire auction is DSIC. So suppose I asked you, okay, so instead of giving it to the bidder with the highest bid, what if as a thought experiment we are giving it to the bidder with the second highest bid? Is that implementable? And the answer to that is very hard to come up, right? So given the allocation rule, how would you check over all possible payment rules and then come up with the answer yes or no, saying okay, this is indeed an implementable allocation rule, or this is indeed this is not an implementable allocation rule. But the nice thing about this definition is, if someone tells you that x is an implementable allocation rule, that is you have an x comma p auction, the payment rule p says that x comma p is a DSIC auction, then look at all the guarantees which you get for free. So you have something which is absolutely powerful, right? You just say as a bidder, you can't lie to me. You would have to write down your truthful valuations on your bid. So we have guarantees like this which follow an implementable allocation rule. Now we are looking at the next definition, something called a monotone allocation rule. An allocation rule x is said to be monotone if for every bidder I, and once we fix all the bids by other bidders b minus I, that's a notation, the allocation of xi z comma b minus I is non-decreasing in its bid z. So what am I saying? Once you have fixed the bids of all other bidders, by increasing my bid, I'm not going to get something lower, or the amount of good which I am getting should not reduce. So examples, auction that awards goods to the highest bidder is monotone. Why? So originally till you are not the highest bidder, you will be getting 0. By increasing your bid, you'll start going up the ladder with respect to the ascending order of bids, and then once you cross the highest bidder, you get the good. And from here on, you can keep on pushing your bid higher, but you will realize that the good is going to stay with you. The total amount of good which you have is not going to reduce by increasing your bid. But consider our thought experiment auction where we award the good to the second highest bidder. So what is that going to do? So originally I'm going to get no good when I bid 0, and when I start increasing my good, and when I just overtake the second highest bidder, I'll be the second highest bidder then. and I'll be having the good. And when I keep pushing my bid further up, at some point I'll overtake the highest bidder. Then the original highest bidder will be the second highest bidder, and he will get the good. And the total amount of good which I get would have reduced. Originally, previously before overtaking the highest bidder, I was getting 1 unit of good, and now I'm getting 0 units of good. So, awarding the good to the second highest bidder is not a monotone allocation rule. So, in a monotone allocation rule, by increasing your bid, like the total amount of good which you get should not decrease. And in a monotone allocation rule, it is not very hard to check that the rule is indeed a monotone. So all you have to do is you just have to assume bids from like the other bidders, and then I'm going to say, okay, now I'll pretend as if one bidder is increasing his bid, and then we will have to verify that the function is indeed increasing or it is not decreasing. But verifying whether a rule is implementable is very hard. So if I ask you, is by awarding the good to the second highest bidder, can I get a DSIC option for some payment rule P? But again, notice my implementable rule would give me a lot of heavy guarantees. It said, okay, you can design an auction where no bidder can lie and then go home happier. The best he can do is to tell the truth. But the monotone allocation rule gives you no such property straight away. All it says is by some bidder increasing his bid, like he's going to get more good, or the total number of good, total amount of good which he is getting would not decrease. Okay, so I just reiterated on the the pluses and minuses of having, or if you just have an intuitive idea that some rule is a monotone or some rule is an implementable rule, then what are the pluses and minuses we would face while trying to establish the fact. And now comes the surprising result. Okay, I'll just give you an example before showing the surprising result. So this is like the Vickrey auction, the example A. So till you reach a certain point, you will get 0 good, and from that point onwards, when you overtake the highest bidder, you will get 1 unit of good. Okay, so this example is like part B is like saying the highest bidder will get something like 0.6, the second highest bidder will get 0.3, and the third highest bidder will get 0.1 unit of the good. So originally from 0 to a certain point, you will get no good, and when you overtake the third highest bidder, you will get 0.1 unit of the good, which is here. And when you overtake the second highest bidder, you will overtake the next bidder, and then you'll keep overtaking. So that's the idea here. Okay, and now comes the surprising result. This is due to Meyerson, a paper which he published in 1981. An allocation rule X is implementable if and only if the rule X is also monotone. So what does this result say? So something which is really hard to establish, which gives you really nice guarantees, is also very easy to establish, because it in some sense it's also monotone, and monotones, as we intuitively noticed, it's very easy to verify. So an allocation rule X is implementable if and only if X is a monotone. And further, if X is implementable, then there is a unique payment rule P that makes X comma P DSIC. So if X is an implementable rule, well, there could have been a payment rule P1, a payment rule P2, a payment rule P3, which made X comma P1 DSIC, X comma P2 DSIC, X comma P3 DSIC. But no, we say X comma P is the only possible way in which we can make X the auction DSIC. Okay, and 3 is like a bonus which we get out of 1 and 2, or the manner in which we prove or proof. The actual payment rule, or the decision of what to charge the bidder, this is not very hard, or it is not an abstract object where we say, oh, it looks something like this, but I'm not pretty sure. Like, you have an explicit way of writing down what the payment rule is. Okay, so sir, should I take any questions? Is there any question here? Questions till now?
So can you clarify whether this monotone and monotonicity of functions is similar? How is it related?
Okay, so a monotonous function is like, it's you're looking at f of x equals y. So we say that the function is monotonously increasing if when we increase the value of x, f of x also increases. So for example, you look at f of x equals x cube, say. So when when x equals -1, f of x equals -1. When x equals 0, f of x equals 0. When x equals 1, f of x equals 1. X equals 2, f of x equals 8. So when we are increasing x, the value of the function is also increasing. So that is when we say that the function is monotonously increasing. So we say that the function is monotonically non-decreasing or strictly or non-strictly monotonically increasing when the function does not decrease at any point. So for example, if the function is -1 at -1 and the function is -1 at 0 as well, and f of x is 1 at 1, say. So this means that the function did not decrease between -1 and 0. So then we say that the function is monotonically increasing, but it is not strict. And it is similar in this sense because once we fix the bids of every other bidder, the allocation which I get is like a monotonous function, right? A monotonically increasing function. Yes, sir. So was it clear, or should I repeat that? Or is there
No, it was clear. You can proceed. Thank you.
So we'll prove the lemma. So first we'll consider an implementable allocation rule X. Then, by definition, when did we say that the rule X is implementable? We say that X is implementable when there is a payment rule P, which makes the auction X comma P DSIC. Then we ask the question, hey, okay, what would P look like? We try to construct P, saying, okay, so X has, we have a nice property that X comma P is actually DSIC. Why not we try to construct P explicitly? Okay. So I'll again remind the DSIC condition for every bidder I, and by bids other than the bidder I. So we will call that notation B minus I. We have been calling that B minus I maximizes his utility by submitting his bid truthfully. So what does bidder I submit? He bids his valuation. Okay. So fix a bidder I. So we will prove this result for a particular bidder I. And because we didn't assume any property about this bidder, we can extend this result to every bidder, right? So fix a bidder I, and for convenience of notation, we will denote xi of z comma b minus I. So what does this mean? Xi of z comma b minus I, bidder I is bidding z when the bid submitted by all other bidders is b minus I. So we will call this as x of z. It's just notational convenience. And similarly, pi of z comma b minus I as pz. So the payment which is charged from bidder I, if he is bidding z and every other bidders are bidding b minus I, so we will call that p of z. Okay. Now first notice, if the auction is DSIC, how would the auction be designed in the first place? The auctioneer did not know what the private valuations of the bidders are. So for bidder I, if we replace him by another bidder who has a different private valuation, but both of them bid the same number. So suppose my valuation was 5 and I was replaced by someone else who has a valuation 3. But for some reason both of us decide to place a bid 7. The auction mechanism has no clue to figure out what my actual private valuation is. So that means like given a bid, the auction mechanism has to decide the amount of good to allocate to me. Okay. So the amount of good I get given a bid which I place is independent of my actual private valuation. So what does this mean? So in the middle of an auction, we can pretend that we remove a bidder and put another bidder inside who will be consistent with the bidding the other bidder had done, but who has a different valuation. And then we can still claim, okay, DSIC holds because DSICness still holds, saying that the new bidder would also maximize his utility by bidding his true value. So substituting bidders would not break the DSICness condition. So what will we do? Consider two positive real numbers y and z such that y is strictly less than z. Okay, and we will pretend y and z are going to be the private valuations of two bidders. So originally, the first of those two bidders has the identity card bidder I, and then he gets into the auction. He has a valuation z, and he decides to submit a false bid y. Okay, so we'll just try. We'll see what happens. And because the auction x comma p is DSIC, he can't get better by lying, and he is lying by placing a false bid y. So what did he? So what can we say here? The utility of bidding truthfully, that is z times x of z. Z is his private valuation times x of z. X of z is what he gets. So z times x of z is the total amount of good he gets minus the payment pz is greater than or equal to z times x of y. Z is his private valuation and x of y is the amount of good he gets minus the payment he makes. Now note that we are not writing it as y times x of y. And why is that? Just because he placed a false bid does not mean his private valuation is changing. The total value which he places on the good is just going to be z irrespective of what he bids. And now that his total valuation of good is z and he gets x of y by bidding y, the value of the good which the auction gives to him is going to be z times x of y, and he's going to pay p of y. So his utility is going to be z times x of y minus p of y. And we get z of x of z minus p of z is greater than or equal to z times x of y minus p of y, because by placing a false bid, no one can get better. And now we'll consider the second case. Suppose the other bidder which we are having in our mind, who has a private valuation y. So he wears the identity card saying bidder I, and he walks into the hall, and he decides to submit a false bid z. Then what can we say? Same as before. His actual utility is greater than his utility by bidding his valuation is greater than or equal to his utility by bidding a false valuation. This false valuation here being his false bid being z here. So y times x of y minus p of y is greater than or equal to y times x of z minus p of z. Okay. So now consider these two inequalities. We are going to rearrange terms in these two inequalities, and then we are going to club them together. So in the first inequality, this inequality here, we'll get p of z to this side, and we'll move z times x of y to the other side. So what will give us? Z times x of z minus z times x of y is greater than or equal to pz minus py. So that gives us this part of the inequality. Now where my mouse is hovering. And now we look at the second inequality. We'll move pz to the other side and move y times x of y to this side. So what will we have? We have pz minus py is greater than or equal to y times xz minus xy. And we have this in the second part of the inequality, right? And I claim that we have already got our monotonicity condition, that x is a monotone. Why is that? From this inequality here, we obtain y times x of z minus x of y is less than or equal to z times x of z minus x of y. And note that y is less than z. So when does this inequality hold? This inequality holds if and only if x of z is greater than x of y. And why is that true? When you multiply by a negative number, the inequality reverses, right? So suppose x of z minus x of y is minus 1. I know my y is less than z, and multiplying by minus 1 will ensure my minus y is greater than minus z. So that means this inequality here is true if and only if x of z is less than or equal x of y is less than or equal to x of z. So what does it mean? If y is less than z and if x is a is an implementable allocation rule, then it is also a monotone, because the amount of good which he receives by bidding, which a bidder receives by bidding z, is greater than or equal to the amount of good which he receives by bidding y, which is less than z, right? So we have proved one part of the big claim, that if an allocation rule is implementable, it is also a monotone. Okay, so now that we have proved it, we will also start using this result. From here on, what we are going to do is we are going to prove everything from in a big scoop. So we got this inequality, right? We are going to keep using this inequality repeatedly to almost get every result which we want. Okay, so what is our key inequality? It says y times x of z minus x of y less than or equal to p of z minus p of y less than or equal to z times x of z minus x of y. So what we will do, we will keep y constant, and we will do a thought experiment where z gets very close to y. So originally, if b was 1, y was 1 and z was 2, from 2 we are going to keep reducing our z and get it close to 1, and then we will see how this function is going to behave, or this inequality is going to behave. Now note that if there is no jump in the graph of x at y, so I'll go back to give you this picture. So note that there is a jump in this graph at this point, whereas there is no jump in this graph at this point. And if we are looking at a point where there is no jump like this, so that means my x of z equals x of y, because there is no jump in the allocation which happens around y. So what do I get? I get 0 less than or equal to p of z minus p of y, which is less than or equal to 0. So what does this say? I know that 0 is less than or equal to this value in between, which is also less than or equal to 0. So which means p of z minus p of y equal to 0. Okay, this is one nice property which we get. We'll look at the case when there is actually a jump. Now when z is very close to y, and the left hand side and the right hand side of the key inequality would be equal to each other. Why is that? X of z minus x of y would be a constant, and y and z are very close. They just differ by very small real numbers. And what we are doing, we are taking it very close. From a previous talk, I'd maybe just use the word. We are taking something like a limit of limit as z tends to y. Okay. And because we are taking the limit of z tends to y, what is my left hand side of the inequality? It says z times x of z minus x of y is less than or equal to p of z minus p of y. And what is the right hand side of the inequality? It says z times x of z minus x of y is greater than or equal to p of z minus p of y. Or I can even say it this way: y times x of z minus x of y is less than or equal to p of z minus p of y, and p of z minus p of y is less than or equal to y times x of z minus x of y. Now I'm using y and z interchangeably in this case, instead of when in the multiplier, because they are very close. But note that it may happen that x of z and x of y are far apart, because when we look here, when z is here, somewhere here, and y is here, we see that x of z minus x of y is far apart, but z is still very close to y. So that's how I'm going to substitute my variables to be in the above inequalities. So now note that the right hand side and the left hand side of the inequalities will become equal, and this guy here is sandwiched by that equal value. So suppose this guy is 5, I have 5 less than or equal to p of z minus p of y, which is less than or equal to 5. So that means p of z minus p of y must be equal to 5, right? Hence I would write y times x of z minus x of y equals p of z minus p of y. So what does this mean? My p of z minus p of y is the jump in the payment at y, or when you are somewhere around y. If a bidder slightly increases his bid from y to something very close to y, the payment which he has to pay jumps, and that jump is actually equal to y times the jump in the allocation at y. Okay, so this is going to be the key equation from here on. So what does it say? The jump in the payment at y equals y times the jump in the allocation at y. Okay, along with this, we also know that at y equals 0, that is if the bidder is bidding 0, he doesn't get anything. Hence we know that the jump at every point, and we also know that the value of the function p at 0. So, and originally note that our notation of p is essentially pi of z comma b minus I. So I'll put back the notation here. So my pi of bi comma b minus I equals summation from j equal 1 to L zj times jump in xi. So what does this mean? So originally we'll pretend that the bid is at 0, and we'll slowly keep increasing the bid from 0 to the actual bid which he submit, that is bi. Okay, and originally the payment which he has to pay is also 0. And what are the points at which the payment increases? That is the points at which there is a jump in the allocation function. And what is the jump in the payment at each of those points? Zj times jump in the allocation function at Zj. And how do we calculate a total payment? We'll have to sum over all the jumps in the payment. So we'll sum over Zj from 1 to L, where Z1 comma Z2 comma so on till ZL are the points where there's a jump in the allocation in the range 0 comma bi. So we'll ask the question, what does this mean? So originally when when we are pretending that the bid is 0, the bidder would get nothing and he is paying nothing. And when we are increasing the bid, there would be some point where in some sense he is going to outbid a few other bidders. And at that point, we have already determined what is the difference in bid for the difference in allocation he is getting. So so when he outbids a few bidder, when he increases his bid from Z1 to something just above Z1, so that means there is a jump in the allocation. So now he has secured the amount, some amount of good which he would get by outbidding a few other bidders. And the bill which he has to pay for the amount of good which he has secured is computed at this point. It is not computed at the end. And what is the actual payment which he has to pay? It is the payment, or it is the money which he has to pay in order to outbid the bidders at that point. So this is more like a local property than something like a global property. So we don't say if he gets 0.9 units at the end, what is his the jump in payment at 0.3. We say his jumps in payment 0.3 together contributes to his actual payment which he has to pay at the end when he gets 0.9. Okay. Now we'll just think what has actually happened. So we begin by assuming that X is an implementable allocation rule, and we ended up with a payment rule P that makes X comma P DSIC. So given that X is an allocation rule, implies P is the rule that makes X comma P DSIC. And each of these steps which we made were forced, right? So once we began with the inequalities, each step was forced. So this means the payment X comma P is the payment rule P is unique such that X comma P is DSIC. And also as a bonus, we explicitly computed the payment rule because like along with the proof we got this equation at the end. Pi of bi comma b minus I equals summation j equals 1 to L zj times jump in xi at b minus I at zj. Okay. So wait, are there any questions at this point, sir?
No.
Okay. Yes. So note that we have one part of the proof left. So what did we show? When you begin with an implementable allocation function, we showed that it is also monotone, and we showed that since it is implementable and a monotone, we proved that there exists a unique payment P which makes X comma P DSIC, and we were able to explicitly compute the payment rule P. So the only part which is remaining is to show that when we start with a monotone allocation rule X, it is also implementable. Now, so for a moment, if we pretend that it actually is implementable, so what does our previous theorem teaches? It says there exists a unique rule for which the allocation rule is implementable, right? So if there is any hope for a monotone allocation rule to be implementable as well, it has to be for that unique rule which we just computed. So we will just try using the considering the option X comma that unique rule payment rule P, and then we'll just check whether the option is actually DSIC, thus making X implementable. Okay. So given the rule X, we'll consider P equals P1 comma P2 comma so on till Pn, or it has to be P of B equals P of B1 comma so on till Pn. That makes X comma P DSIC, where Pi of Bi comma B minus I is given by J equals 1 to L Zj times jump in Xi, fixing the bids of all other bidders at Zj. Okay. And then we'll give a nice proof by picture for the same. So what I would encourage is you go back and then try giving an algebraic proof. Okay, the proof by picture is a very nice proof. So we'll look at our first column. Our first column is when the bidder actually places his true valuation to be the bid. Okay. The second column is the scenario when the bidder places a bid which is greater than this true valuation as a bid. And the third column is the scenario when a bidder places a bid which is less than his actual valuation as a bid. Okay. So one is when he actually bids his valuation. Second is when he overbids. 3 is when he underbids. First row we are looking at the utility. The first row we are looking at the value which the function gives to him. So what is the value of the function? The value given by the auction to him. So we'll consider the case when he bids his valuation. So he bids V and he gets X of V. So the value which he gets is V times X of V. So look that the x-axis is contains Z, and the y-axis contains X of Z. So what is V times X of V? It is the area of the rectangle given by the length of the rectangle, or the x-axis part of the rectangle has length V, and the y-axis component of the rectangle has length X of V. Then the area of the rectangle would be V times X of V. Okay. And consider the scenario when he overbids. When he overbids, let's say he places an overbid of value B. The value which the auction gives to him is V times X of B. So in the x-axis, we would consider a length of V. In the y-axis, we consider a length of X of Z. Then the value which he gets is the area of this rectangle, V times X of B. Similarly, if he bids an underbid B and his valuation is V, we are considering the value which he gets is V times X of B even in this scenario, because we consider the length V in the x-axis and X of B in the y-axis. Now consider the payment which he has to make. So what is the payment? So the payment is the value at which a jump happens, that is zi, times the actual jump in the allocation which happens. We are summing up over all such jumps. Okay. So can you see the rectangle which I am trying to highlight? Or I'm just trying to go over by hovering my mouse. So that is the value of the payment or the increase in the payment at the first jump. So when he goes from 0 to the first point of jump, say z1, so the jump at the payment which he has to make is z1 times the jump in the allocation at that point. So the first jump is the area of this rectangle which I'm hovering my mouse around. And when you look at the second rectangle, at the second jump, which is at z2, the jump is going to be z2 times the jump in the allocation rule at z2. And what is that? It is going to be the area of this big rectangle. Why? The length is going to be z2 and the height is going to be the difference or the increase in the allocation. Because when we start, the allocation was, when we started his allocation, he had been already receiving a certain allocation, which was determined at the first jump. And here he has, he is getting more good. So the difference is going to be this height. So the length times height is going to be this rectangle, which I'm trying to highlight by hovering mouse around. So what is the total payment? The area of the first rectangle I highlighted plus the area of the second rectangle I highlighted. So the total payment is the area in pink. So similarly, we would have to sum up everything till we reach this bid bi. So the area of the the area of the payment which he has to make is the area in pink here. And similarly, the payment which he has to make when he underbids is also the area in pink here. Now, what is the utility? The utility is the value which he gets minus the area, right? Or minus the payment which he makes, right? And what is the difference between the value he gets minus the payment he makes? This is the area in green. Why? Like this area outside the zigzag line is common to both the payment and the value which he gets. So it is the area in green which will be his utility when he bids his actual valuation as the bid. But when he overbids, note that the blue colored area is the value which he gets, and the pink colored area is the payment which he has to make. So that means the green color area is the difference between these two. But notice the payment also covers an area outside the blue box here. So I would have to remove that from my green area. Hence the utility which the bidder receives will be the green area minus the lined area or the diagonally shaded area. And note that this is less than the utility when he bids his truthful valuation, because the green area in both the graphs are the same, and we are removing something from the green area when he overbids. And when he underbids, again note that the difference or the utility is the difference between the value he gets and the payment which he has to make, which is the blue area minus the pink area, which is the green area. Now note that the green area, the utility which he received while he made his when he bid truthfully, is more than the utility which he is receiving by underbidding, right? So which means when he overbids, he gets a lesser utility, and when he underbids, then again he'll get a lesser utility. So what is the upshot of all this? So we say if X is a monotone, then the same payment rule which we computed, which made an implementable rule into d-sig-auction, it makes X into an allocation rule, and X comma P is still a d-sig-auction. And the nice upshot is, so we originally were thinking about how to show that an auction a rule is implementable. It felt very hard, right? But the guarantees which we got is very beautiful. So what did the guarantees give us? It says no bidder can place false bids, or if any bidder decides to lie, he is going to be penalized. And we would want to leverage on strong guarantees like this in order to prove some nice results when we are working from here on. But showing that a function, allocation function is implementable at first shot looked very hard. But now we just said the allocation rule is implementable if and only if it is also a monotone. And verifying whether a function is indeed a monotone is very easy. Meaning we just have to fix the bids by every other bidder, and then we would have to roll the value of a particular bidder from 0 to wherever, and then we can verify that in a very easy manner. So what do we do? In order to get our powerful DC guarantees, we would make use of the fact that the allocation rule is also monotone, verify the easy to verify result, and then start using all our hard guarantees for free. So that is the nice upshot from all of this. So this is the reference page. And if you have any comments, feedbacks, or anything about this lecture, please email adityanganesh@cmi.ac.in. Thank you. And in the middle of the lecture, Dr. Rajiv Gandhi also joined us for the lecture. I would like to thank him for joining the lecture. Thank you very much, sir.
So Adityan, there are a couple of questions, quick questions, because we are running out of time, but quick questions before we do a vote of thanks. So one student has asked, we assume that x of z is continuous, but that is clearly not so in the graphs.
No, so we do not assume that x of z is continuous. We just assume that x of z is an increasing function. And another point which I actually forgot, which I wanted to make but I did not make is, we proved this result when there are only finitely many jumps, because we had a summation from I equals 1 to L. But this result is not very hard to extend even on a continuously increasing graph, because we can replace our summation by an integral. So that is the only difference between our piecewise function versus a continuous function. When we do our integral, just replace every summations by an integral, and every step would hold without changing any words.
Thank you. And Shreyan had a question, if it's okay to unmute him. His.
Yes, sir. So I guess I'll stop my screen share.
Yeah.
Shreyan, yes.
I have a method.
Yes, Shreyan.
Okay, I have a continuous method. Okay.
Okay.
Let us say it is a cake we are giving.
Sorry, it is a
cake.
Okay.
This one will actually be, everybody will get something in this one. Okay. Okay, we are assuming at least 1%, everybody will get 0 things and some cake. Okay. And 1% will get, 1% has a high probability of getting something.
What do you mean by probability here?
Meaning that it has a 100% probability. Like, sometimes. Okay, sir. Remember that cake cutting algorithm you gave us?
Okay.
We are going to implement that.
But Shreyan, I think that is off topic because I didn't do the cake cutting algorithm in this lecture, right?
What?
But we would actually take the cake cutting algorithm discussion offline. Is that fine?
What?
So, we didn't discuss the cake cutting algorithm in this session, right? So I guess that will keep the others out of the discussion. So I guess we would take that offline. Is that fine?
Okay.
Thank you, Shreyan. So, Sanaya, let me unmute you. Sanaya, are you there?
Yes, yes.
Can you increase the volume? You are not audible.
Am I audible now?
It can be better.
Hello?
Yeah. Yes, Sanaya.
I would like to thank Adityan for this beautiful session. I guess we all can appreciate the passion and the clarity with which he has taught, and the fact that he ensures that this clarity is passed on. I have known Adityan personally since 4 years, and every time his session is going to be there, I'm equally excited to attend it because of the way he teaches. I'm sure that a lot of us will take this session as a head start to explore more into algorithmic game theory. This topic can be very confusing at times, but the way he teaches and the way he clarifies the doubts, it's so easier. So thank you once again, Adityan, for this great session.
Thank you very much, Sanaya.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And batches A, B, C, they can look at their schedule, and batch D also look at your schedule and join the Zoom meetings accordingly. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your evening.